4:51 a.m. Sarpy County, Nebraska, November 18th, 2025. The cul-de-sac looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. Above-ground pools covered for winter. Soccer nets folded flat against chain-link fences. A subdivision so ordinary it had no name anyone bothered to use, just a zip code and a school district boundary. Frost had settled on the windshields of the cars parked in the driveways. A dog 2 houses down had barked once, around 4:30, and then gone quiet. The street lights at the entrance to the cul-de-sac cast orange circles on the pavement that went nowhere. Nothing moved. The split-level rental at the end of Meridian Court had its porch light on. It was always on. 12 federal agents held position behind the tree line at the edge of the cul-de-sac. They had been in position since 3:40 a.m., staged in complete silence, no radio traffic, no visible light. The agents wore tactical vests over civilian cold weather layers. The temperature at ground level was 23 degrees. Breath condensed and disappeared. No one moved unnecessarily. 4 more agents were staged at the rear of the duplex, in the narrow gap between the fence and the detached garage, a gap approximately 4 feet wide, enough for a single-file stack but not enough for error. A K-9 unit crouched in the bed of an unmarked pickup truck 60 yards back, the handler's hand resting flat on the dog's spine. Still, waiting. The dog's name was Recon. He had worked 12 prior warrant executions. His handler would later say that Recon went still in a particular way when something was wrong inside a building. Not agitated, but alert in a way that was distinct from boredom. He had been still that way since 3:50 a.m. The command came through earpieces at 4:53 a.m. The stack moved. Inside that duplex, behind windows screwed shut and curtains that never moved, 6 young women had been living in the dark for 104 days. This is the story of how they were found. Not the story the sentencing coverage told, the courtroom version, the charges, the plea agreements. The other story. The one that began not with a federal warrant, but with a night shift ER nurse in Omaha who looked at a patient's chart and noticed something that should not have been there. One detail. That is all it took. One detail pulled until everything unraveled. The victims' names, the operators' names, the specific addresses, these are changed for this reconstruction. The framework is real. The federal case that produced the sentencings reported in July of 2026 is the spine. The rescue arc is what courtroom coverage almost never shows. So we start at the beginning, not 4:53 a.m. on November 18th. Earlier. We start in late July of 2025 with a young woman named Dani Kowalski. Dani was 24 years old. She worked as a pharmacy technician at a Walgreens counter in Council Bluffs, Iowa. The kind of job where you know the regular customers by their prescriptions, where you hear everything and say nothing, where you go home smelling like the cleaning solution they use on the floor. She had a boyfriend who worked as SHVAC. She had a mother in Omaha she called twice a week, always on Sunday evenings and Thursday mornings, always for at least 40 minutes. She had been saving for a security deposit on her own apartment, $4,200 in the account. She had toured a 1-bedroom near the Missouri River in June. The kitchen was too small, but the light was good. On July 22nd, 2025, Dani Kowalski did not come home from a shift. Her boyfriend called her cell phone 11 times. Her mother called 6 times. At 11:15 p.m., her mother filed a missing person report with the Council Bluffs Police Department. The officer who took the report was patient and thorough. He noted that Dani had no history of mental health crisis, no history of drug use, no known enemies. Her car was found in the Walgreens parking lot. Her keys were on the front seat. Her phone was in the glove box. Her work badge was still clipped to the lanyard on the passenger headrest. She had clocked out at 8:47 p.m. That last detail, the phone in the glove box, was the thing her mother kept coming back to when she called the FBI tip line every Friday for 3 months. She would never leave her phone, she said, every time. Never. Not once. She slept with it plugged in next to the bed. She would have gone back for it. She was right. Danny Kowalski was not the only one. Between July and September of 2025, 5 other young women went missing across a 200-mile corridor in eastern Nebraska and western Iowa. A 22-year-old waitress from Lincoln named Maya Reyes disappeared from a gas station on a Tuesday morning. She had stopped for coffee on her way to a bridal appointment. The gas station cameras showed her walking toward the edge of the lot, and then nothing. A 26-year-old dental hygienist from Fremont named Carolyn Marsh had $300 cash withdrawn from an ATM the morning she disappeared. Investigators initially treated that withdrawal as a potential voluntary departure before her family showed documentation of porch repairs she had been planning to pay for. A 23-year-old from Grand Island, 6 weeks from her wedding, vanished from a Walmart parking lot on a Saturday afternoon while her fiancé waited in the car. He had been in the driver's seat for 18 minutes before he went inside to look for her. He found her cart half full, abandoned near the paper goods aisle. 2 more women from the Omaha metro area, ages 25 and 27, reported missing within 10 days of each other in late August. 6 missing women. 6 separate police jurisdictions. 6 separate missing person files. No common employer, no common neighborhood, no common social circle that anyone could identify in the initial weeks. Investigators ran the standard intersection queries, cross-referenced the tip lines, pulled social media history, contact lists, location data from the devices that had been recovered. The Lincoln woman and the Grand Island woman had attended the same regional community college but 3 years apart, with no overlap. The Council Bluffs woman and one of the Omaha women had both visited the same urgent care clinic at different times in the spring, a coincidence that took 2 weeks to rule out. What investigators did not know was that all 6 were already in the same building. The duplex on Meridian Court in Sarpy County had been rented in June of 2025 by a man whose name appeared on the lease as Craig Vinson. A property management company handled the unit remotely. The listed occupation, freelance logistics consultant, monthly rent paid on time, always by electronic transfer, always from the same account registered to a business entity with a landscaping-sounding name. No noise complaints. No visible violations. The neighbors, when they were later interviewed, described the tenants as quiet. One neighbor thought she had seen a woman through the curtains once, early in the summer. She assumed it was a girlfriend. Another neighbor had waved at someone unloading groceries from a trunk one afternoon in July, and the person had waved back without making eye contact. He thought nothing of it. The interior of the duplex told a different story. Interior door hardware had been reversed. The locking mechanism faced outward on every bedroom door, meaning the rooms could be secured from the hallway. Bedroom windows had been screwed into their frames from outside, the screws countersunk and painted over, so that the modification was not visible from the interior. The basement had been partially finished, its single exterior window covered with a layer of drywall painted to match the foundation. A generator sat in the garage, wired to a circuit breaker that could cut power to individual rooms independently. The breaker panel had been modified. A licensed electrician who later examined it during evidence processing told investigators it was competent work, the kind done by someone who understood electrical systems. Two individuals rotated through the property on a weekly schedule. The FBI, when they later reconstructed the timeline, would refer to them internally as the housekeepers. They arrived in separate vehicles. They brought groceries, bulk items, protein bars, packaged food, the kind of inventory that minimized trips. They left with trash in bags they took with them rather than setting out for collection. The duplex's assigned trash bin sat at the curb, always empty, never touched. One neighbor had noticed the trash bin. She mentioned it to her husband in passing sometime in August. He said maybe they composted. It seemed minor. She forgot about it. That small detail, the trash that was never put out, would surface later in federal documents as one of several behavioral indicators that, in isolation, meant nothing and, in combination, described a controlled environment. I spent time going through the early case documentation on this, and one thing kept nagging at me. The indicators were visible. Individually, each one had an innocent explanation. But the cluster of them, the reversed locks, the screwed windows, the generator, the managed trash, the grocery runs, that happened on no regular schedule and always from a vehicle parked close to the garage door, that cluster was unmistakable to anyone who was looking for it. The problem was that nobody had a reason to look. Not yet. The reason came from an emergency room in Omaha on the night of October 4th, 2025. At 9:47 p.m., a woman was brought into Nebraska Medicine by a man who identified himself as her cousin. The patient, later identified as 23-year-old Renata Sullivan, one of the two Omaha women reported missing in August, showed signs of severe dehydration and prolonged confinement. She was wearing shoes that did not fit her. Size 8 on a size 6 foot. She was wearing someone else's clothes, a gray hooded sweatshirt 2 sizes too large and jeans with a waistband cinched with a braided belt. She had no bag. She had no identification. The admitting nurse, a woman with 11 years in emergency medicine named Priya Okonkwo, processed the intake. Standard questions. Medical history. Home address. Renata Sullivan could not name the street she lived on. She gave a city, Omaha, and stopped. She looked at the wall. She said she was not sure. Priya Okonkwo noted that the patient's affect was flat, but her eyes were tracking, alert. She was not intoxicated. She was not in mental health crisis. She looked, Okonkwo would later tell federal investigators, like someone who had been somewhere for a long time and was not yet sure where she was now. The man who had brought her in said she had been sick. He gave an address. He gave a phone number. He said he would be in the waiting room. He was not in the waiting room when Priya Okonkwo went to check 20 minutes later. The chairs he had been directed toward were empty. The desk staff had not seen him leave. Security footage from the lobby showed him walking toward the exterior doors 4 minutes after dropping Sullivan at the intake desk. He had not stopped at any desk. He had not spoken to anyone. He had simply walked out. Priya Okonkwo flagged the chart. She noted the presenting condition, the ill-fitting clothing, the inability to provide a residential address, and the disappearance of the accompanying individual. She elevated it to the charge nurse. The charge nurse called hospital security. Hospital security called the Omaha Police Department. The OPD officer who responded ran Renata Sullivan's name. She appeared in the system. Missing person, reported August 29th. Open case. He immediately escalated to the Omaha FBI field office. The time was 11:22 p.m. What happened next moved faster than almost any case the field office had processed in recent memory. The most surprising part of this entire investigation is not the raid, and it is not the sentencings. It is the 48 hours between Priya Okonkwo's chart notation and the moment federal prosecutors moved. That window, less than 2 days, is extraordinary for a case of this complexity, and it happened because of a chain of decisions made by ordinary people who did exactly what they were supposed to do. Within 4 hours of the OPD escalation, the FBI had confirmed Renata Sullivan's identity, alerted the task force already monitoring several open missing person cases in the eastern Nebraska corridor, and obtained a court-approved ping on the vehicle the man who brought her in had driven to the hospital. The vehicle was identified through Nebraska Medicine's parking lot camera system, which had captured the plate on entry at 9:41 p.m. The camera was mounted at the lot entrance and captured rear plates on vehicles turning in. The plate was clear, unobstructed, illuminated by the overhead lighting. It was the kind of camera footage that looks routine until it matters completely. The vehicle was registered to a shell entity incorporated in Wyoming in March of 2025. That entity had no assets, no employees, and no operating history. But it had one transaction on record, a fuel card linked to purchases at 4 gas stations in Sarpy County and one in Council Bluffs, all within a 12-mile radius. The center of that radius, Meridian Court. FBI surveillance teams were on Meridian Court within 22 hours of Renata Sullivan's hospital admission. A 2-person mobile team in an unmarked sedan, a static observer positioned in a utility easement to the north, behind a row of bare-limbed ornamental trees. A camera unit mounted in the housing of a utility junction box at the far end of the block, installed during a 3-hour window in the early morning of October 6th, during which the team posed as a contracted maintenance crew. The installation took 11 minutes. The camera had a 140-degree field and transmitted on an encrypted channel to a monitoring station 4 miles away. What they observed over the next 72 hours confirmed the operational picture. 2 vehicles made regular stops at the Duplex. One was the Wyoming registered vehicle. The other was a white Hyundai Tucson, registered to a woman later identified as one of the 2 operators. Both vehicles used the attached garage rather than the driveway. The garage door opened, the vehicle pulled in, and the door closed within seconds. Curtains in the lower-level windows never opened. The porch light was on at all hours. The trash bin sat empty at the curb. And on the second night of surveillance, at 2:17 a.m., a ground-level basement window, the one covered with painted drywall, showed a line of light at its edge for approximately 4 minutes. Then it went dark. Someone was in the basement. Put yourself in the position of the surveillance team at that moment. 2:17 in the morning. A line of light at a window that is supposed to be sealed. You are 90 seconds from the front door, and you have to wait, because moving too soon, before the warrants are fully in order, before every team is staged, before every contingency is covered, means the people inside have time to react, means the evidence disappears, means the case collapses on a procedural error. The team lead logged the observation at 2:19 a.m., and transmitted it to the monitoring station. The notation read, "Confirmed activity, lower level, period of illumination 4 minutes approximately, now dark. No action taken pending guidance." That notation, that restraint encoded in bureaucratic language, represented something significant. It represented a team that understood that what they were doing in that moment was not finding these women. It was building the architecture that would let them stay found. Waiting was the hardest call. And it was the right one. The federal search warrant application was filed under seal on October 9, 2025. A federal magistrate in the District of Nebraska reviewed and signed it the same day. The operational plan was developed jointly between the Omaha field office and the FBI's hostage rescue team, which had been activated and positioned in the region by October 7th, before the warrant was signed. HRT assets checked into 3 separate hotels in the Omaha metro area under business travel cover. No clustering. No visible coordination. The team lead later said that the hardest operational security requirement in the pre-raid period was not the surveillance. It was making sure nobody at a hotel breakfast bar asked the wrong question to the wrong person. Here is what the operational plan had to account for. 6 potential victims in an unknown distribution across the duplex's upper and lower floors. 2 known operators who rotated on a weekly schedule. The surveillance team had determined that the handoff typically occurred on Monday mornings. A basement with no confirmed secondary exit. A generator in the garage capable of cutting power to individual rooms. And an unknown quantity of other individuals who might be present on a given night. The plan also had to account for something the team discovered 36 hours before the scheduled entry. The building plans on file with Sarpy County showed the duplex's interior layout as standard for its construction year. A central staircase, 3 bedrooms on the upper floor, a living area and kitchen on the main floor, and a finished basement, accessed by a staircase off the kitchen. That was the layout on paper. Aerial thermal imaging of the structure, conducted by a fixed-wing asset operating at altitude on the night of October 11th, showed heat signatures inconsistent with the documented layout. There appeared to be an additional partition in the basement that the building plans did not show. A wall that was not supposed to be there. The imaging analyst who reviewed the data flagged it within 20 minutes of processing. The heat signatures on the lower level resolved into 2 distinct zones separated by what appeared to be a non-insulated interior partition. One zone aligned with the documented basement layout. The other was smaller, roughly rectangular, and showed a lower average temperature, consistent with a space that had less ventilation and no exterior exposure. The team had 20 minutes to revise the entry sequence before the briefing was locked. They did it in 12. In the weeks between the warrant being signed and the raid being executed, the surveillance picture continued to build. The monitoring team logged every vehicle approach, every observed light pattern, every variation in the routine. On October 19th, the Wyoming registered vehicle arrived at the duplex at 11:40 a.m. and departed 40 minutes later. This was outside the established pattern. The deviation was flagged, analyzed, and ultimately attributed to a grocery run. The team tracked the timing from lot exit to duplex arrival, 22 minutes. The route was consistent with a direct drive. No stops. No apparent counter-surveillance maneuvers. On November 2nd, a second thermal imaging pass was conducted. The heat signature in the undocumented basement space had shifted position since the October 11th pass. Instead of one concentrated zone in the northwest corner of the partition, there were now 2 distributed zones across the space. The imaging analyst's report noted this without conclusion. But the operational team drew the inference: the number of individuals in the concealed room had changed, or their arrangement had changed. Either way, the space was occupied and had been occupied continuously for the duration of the surveillance period. The briefing for the raid team was conducted in a leased commercial space in a business park 8 miles from Meridian Court at 10 p.m. on November 17th, 7 hours before the scheduled entry. The space had been used for 3 prior briefings in the weeks leading up to the operation. Maps of the duplex, the cul-de-sac, and the surrounding street grid were mounted on foam boards. The thermal imaging data was printed and laminated. The revised entry sequence was laid out step by step, entry point by entry point, with contingency branches for each major decision node. The team lead walked through it once. then walked through it again, then asked for questions. There were 14. That revised sequence, accounting for the undocumented partition, the generator, and the locations of all heat signatures within the structure, went into effect at 4:53 a.m. on November 18, 2025, when the stack hit the garage side entry of the duplex on Meridian Court. 2 flashbang devices through the garage entry. Simultaneous breach at the rear exterior door. HRT operators moved through the garage and into the main floor in under 9 seconds. The generator was disabled at the circuit panel before it could be manually triggered. The electrician who had examined the modified panel during evidence preparation had provided a diagram indicating the exact breaker location and the sequence required to disable it without triggering the failsafe. That diagram was in the kit of the operator who hit the panel. She had it memorized anyway. A K9 unit entered behind the primary stack and was directed immediately toward the basement stairs. The upper floor was cleared in under 90 seconds. 2 of the young women were found there, both conscious, both in a locked bedroom. The door had been secured from the hallway with a commercial-grade deadbolt installed on an interior frame. The wood around the strike plate had been reinforced with a steel plate screwed through the door frame into the stud behind it. The door opened when the bolt was thrown from outside. The 2 women inside had been awake. One was sitting on a mattress against the far wall. The other was standing near the window, which was screwed shut. They did not move when the door opened. The first operator through identified himself by agency and said the words the victim services coordinator had specified in the briefing. "You are safe. You are going to a hospital. We are federal agents." The woman by the window said nothing. She sat down on the floor slowly, carefully, the way someone sits when their legs have decided before their mind. The main floor operator found the Hyundai's keys on a kitchen counter. The operator, who had been overnight in the duplex, was located in the master bedroom. He did not resist. He was restrained and removed from the structure in approximately 40 seconds. He did not look at the agents around him. He looked at the ground and then at the sky and then at nothing in particular. He made no statement. The basement team was on the stairs when the K9 hit on the partition wall. Not the door, the wall itself. There was no visible seam, no handle, no frame. The partition was sheetrock over 2x4s, painted the same color as the adjacent wall. Access was through a false panel at baseboard level that swung inward on a spring hinge, a panel approximately 18 inches high and 24 inches wide, flush with the baseboard molding, its seam filled with caulk that had been painted over. It was not visible without close examination. Recon found it in 11 seconds. Behind it, 4 young women in a space approximately 9 feet by 12 feet. A finished room with a ventilation grate but no window. A bathroom had been roughed in but not completed. A toilet and a utility sink had been plumbed, but there were no fixtures on the walls, no mirror, no door on the bathroom opening. There were mattresses on the floor, 2 pushed against the north wall and 2 against the east wall. There were personal items, small things, photographs, a book with a broken spine, a phone charger with no phone attached to it. There were cups and plates stacked in a corner. There was a wall calendar, the kind with landscape photographs, open to November. Several dates had been marked with small penciled X's. All 4 were conscious. All 4 required immediate medical attention. One of the 4 could not stand unassisted. The basement team called for medical support and held position until the paramedic cleared the stairs. All 6 women, Renata Sullivan, who had already spent 9 days in hospital recovery, and the 5 others recovered from the duplex, had been reported missing at intervals between late July and early September of 2025. The shortest confirmed period of captivity was 61 days. The longest was 104 days. Danny Kowalski, the pharmacy tech from Council Bluffs whose mother had called the FBI tip line every Friday for 3 months, was one of the 4 women found behind the partition wall in the basement. Emergency medical teams had staged in a tent erected on the cul-de-sac's center island. 2 ambulances, a mobile triage unit, a victim services coordinator from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The tent had been erected in darkness between 3 and 4 a.m. by a team that had practiced the setup twice in an empty parking lot to confirm the timing. The cul-de-sac was closed at both entry points with unmarked vehicles positioned across the road. No press was present. The operation had maintained information discipline for the full 45 days from surveillance initiation to entry. The women were walked out in emergency blankets to the staging tent, one at a time, accompanied by an agent and a paramedic. The cul-de-sac was quiet. The streetlights were still on. The frost was still on the windshields. What happened in the hours that followed had the quality of procedure. It was organized, it was documented, and it was, in its bureaucratic carefulness, an act of extraordinary institutional attention. Danny Kowalski's mother received a phone call at 6:12 a.m. from an FBI victim services coordinator. She was told her daughter was alive, that she was being transported to a hospital, and that she would be able to see her within the hour. The coordinator later noted in the case file that the mother did not say anything for a full 12 seconds after being told her daughter was alive. Then she said, "I knew she left her phone on purpose." She was right about that too. Federal investigators later determined that Renata Sullivan's exit from the duplex, the trip to the ER that broke the case, had not been a controlled release by the operators. It had been an emergency. Sullivan had become critically ill, and the operator had made a calculation that a hospital visit was less risky than the alternative. He drove her himself, left her at the emergency entrance, and walked out of the waiting room when he concluded that something in the intake process had gone wrong. It had. In the 72 hours following the rescue, as the 6 women were assessed and stabilized at 2 regional hospitals, federal investigators began the work of reconstructing what had happened inside the duplex over the preceding months. Victim services coordinators were assigned individually, 1 per woman, and remained present through the initial medical evaluations and into the first round of voluntary interviews conducted when the women indicated they were ready to speak. The interviews were not rushed. 2 of the women chose to wait several days before speaking with investigators. That choice was documented and respected. What the interviews produced, assembled across multiple sessions, cross-referenced against each other, verified against the physical evidence at Meridian Court, was a timeline that federal prosecutors would later describe as among the most thoroughly reconstructed victim accounts in a case of this type in the district's recent history. The women had, without coordination, developed overlapping methods of tracking time. The calendar on the wall of the basement room with its penciled X's was one method. Another was a count maintained by one of the women in pencil on the inside seam of a mattress cover, tick marks in groups of 5, partially obscured by the fold of the fabric. The count, when investigators measured it against the established timeline, was off by 3 days. She had lost track somewhere in the first 2 weeks. After that, she had been exact. Here is what the evidence recovery teams documented at Meridian Court in the 48 hours following the rescue. 14 burner phones were recovered from the main floor, the basement, and the operator's personal vehicle. Several of those phones contained records of electronic communications with a second location, an address in Council Bluffs, Iowa, approximately 11 miles from the duplex. A ledger was recovered from inside a kitchen cabinet, behind a false panel similar in construction to the one concealing the basement room. The ledger documented, in handwritten notation using abbreviations that required forensic analysis to interpret, a schedule of what the federal indictment would later describe as controlled appointments. Names were encoded. Dates ran from August of 2025 through what appeared to be a projected schedule extending into January of 2026. The forensic analyst who interpreted the abbreviations spent 40 hours on the ledger before producing an initial translation. Her report, 63 pages in its filed form, was referenced extensively in the grand jury proceedings. The ledger named a second operator, not the man taken in the duplex, but a different individual whose name appeared repeatedly in the scheduling notations. A second individual who was not present at Meridian Court on the night of the raid. The Council Bluffs address was raided 91 minutes after the Meridian Court entry. That second location, a single-family rental on a residential street, was operated differently. No basement partition. No reversed locks. The second operator used a surveillance camera system installed inside the house, the footage from which was streamed to an encrypted cloud account. The camera positions covered the main floor hallway, the staircase, and the exterior of the rear door. They did not cover the bedrooms, which federal investigators later characterized as a deliberate choice, a distinction that appeared repeatedly in the operational communications recovered from the burner phones, and that suggested an awareness of legal risk. That account, identified through digital forensics on the Meridian Court burner phones within the first 2 hours after the raid, gave investigators the probable cause they needed for the Council Bluffs warrant. The second operator was taken into custody at 6:22 a.m. He was in the kitchen. He had been watching the surveillance feed on a tablet when the team entered. He saw them coming and did not run. Federal agents later noted that he made no statement and asked immediately for counsel. Both operators were in federal custody before sunrise on November 18, 2025. The evidence processing operation at Meridian Court ran for 3 days. An FBI evidence response team cataloged and removed over 400 individual items from the duplex and the detached garage. Photographs of every room were taken before any item was moved. The reverse door hardware was documented in place before removal. The screwed window frames were measured and photographed. The modified electrical panel was examined by a licensed forensic electrician, and its components were cataloged individually. The false panel at baseboard level in the basement was removed intact, frame, spring hinge and all, and transported as a single piece of evidence. It is, as far as federal records indicate, the only piece of physical evidence from the Meridian Court case that was preserved structurally rather than disassembled. The phone charger was logged as item 207 in the evidence catalog. One standard USB charging cable, brand indeterminate, no device attached. Condition, used, no damage. Location, east wall of concealed basement room, on floor adjacent to mattress. It is one line in a 400-item log. It takes 3 seconds to read. It is the item that stays with me longest. The federal indictment returned by a grand jury in the District of Nebraska, the same indictment whose sentencing phase generated the courtroom coverage of July 2026, named both operators and included conspiracy charges supported by the ledger, the burner phone communications, the surveillance footage, and the physical evidence recovered from both locations. Here is what stands out about this case, looked at in its totality. The system that found these women was not a single stroke of investigative genius. It was a chain. A nurse who followed her training. A police officer who checked a database. A mother who called the FBI tip line every Friday. A surveillance analyst who pulled thermal imaging and revised the breach plan 12 minutes before it was locked. Each link mattered. The chain held. The sentencing phase, completed in July of 2026, produced federal sentences in the range of decades for both operators. The plea agreements, negotiated separately, required cooperation with ongoing federal investigations into the network of which the Sarpy County operation was a part. That network. This is the part of the case that the sentencing coverage summarized in a paragraph and then moved past. The two operators convicted in the Omaha proceeding were not the architects of the network they worked within. They were operators, property managers, in the language the federal indictment used. The ledger recovered from the Meridian Court kitchen contained communications with at least two other entities outside Nebraska, whose identities, as of the time of the sentencing hearings, had not been fully resolved. One of those entities used a contact protocol that investigators traced to a cell number active in the Kansas City metro area. That number went dark on November 19, 2025, the day after the Meridian Court raid. It has not reappeared in any monitored communications since. Both sentences were appropriate for what these two operators did. But they were also structurally incomplete justice. The men in federal custody were the hands. The architecture that placed them there, the network that recruited, transported, and coordinated, that layer of the operation remained, as of the July 2026 sentencing date, only partially mapped. Federal prosecutors publicly acknowledged that the investigation was continuing, that the Omaha case was, in their language, a component of a broader inquiry. What the broader inquiry has produced, as of this reporting, is not yet public. Did the system work, or did it only work because one nurse on one shift happened to ask the right question? Is a justice system that depends on that kind of chance encounter a justice system that can be trusted to find the ones who go missing and don't end up in an emergency room? There are details from this case that I keep coming back to, and the one that sits with me most is the phone charger in the basement room. The investigators documented it in the evidence log: one standard USB charging cable, no device attached. Someone had brought it with them or had been given it. There was nothing to charge, and yet it was there. It is the kind of detail that tells you what it needs to tell you without saying anything at all. The 6 women were transported to Nebraska Medicine and a second regional hospital for evaluation. Discharge timelines varied. Caseworkers from the U.S. Attorney's Victim Services Division were assigned to each woman individually. Their families were with them. Maya Reyes, the waitress from Lincoln who had been putting together a wedding registry when she disappeared, was married 9 months after her discharge. The wedding had originally been planned for the fall of 2025. It took place in August of 2026. The federal case was still in its sentencing phase when she signed the marriage certificate. The dental hygienist from Fremont returned to work 4 months after her discharge. The Grand Island woman, the one who had disappeared 6 weeks before her original wedding date, has not spoken publicly. Her family, through a victim services coordinator, declined to participate in any press contact. Danny Kowalski's mother has stopped calling the tip line. There is no reason to call anymore. Some things have been recovered. 6 lives. A federal record. 2 convictions. A ledger that names people who have not yet been found. Some things have not been recovered. The second ledger that federal investigators believed existed based on gap analysis of the scheduling notations. The one that would have covered the period before August of 2025, when the network was operating in some configuration, the Omaha case only partially illuminated. That ledger was not at Meridian Court. It was not at the Council Bluffs address. Requests under the plea agreements for its location have produced no result. Both operators, through their attorneys, indicated they had no knowledge of any prior documentation. Federal investigators assessed that representation as incomplete. The contact in Kansas City has not resurfaced. and the cloud account that stored the Council Bluffs surveillance footage. The encrypted stream the second operator was watching on his tablet when the team came through the door contained 412 hours of footage dating back to March of 2025. Analysis of that footage is ongoing. Some faces in it have not been identified. Some cannot be identified from the angles available. A subpoena for the account's registration data produced a name and an email address, both fictitious, traceable to a device that accessed the account from a public library terminal in a city that is not Kansas City, and not Omaha, and not Council Bluffs. The library's camera system retained 30 days of footage. The account access had occurred 41 days before the subpoena was served. If you've followed similar cases in this region, comment whether you've seen patterns here that connect to what you know. We read everything that comes in, and the Kansas City thread in particular is one we're continuing to track. The duplex on Meridian Court is empty now. The property management company that handled it remotely terminated the lease within 48 hours of the raid. A new tenant has not moved in. The building sits at the end of the cul-de-sac with its porch light off for the first time in however long. The neighbors have noticed that too, in the way neighbors notice the small changes that mean something happened that they don't fully know yet. The above-ground pools in the neighborhood were uncovered when spring arrived. The soccer nets went back up. The subdivision looks exactly the way it looked before November 18th. The trash bin at the end of the cul-de-sac has a new family now. They fill it every week. The network that built those reverse door locks and screwed those windows shut and installed that generator in that garage is not fully identified. The demand that made building it rational still exists. The case is closed. The case is not